I stand at the kitchen sink of my childhood home, listening to my father practice the same speech he's given every Father's Day for 28 years. He's in the dining room now, voice carrying through the walls like smoke, telling my aunts and uncles and cousins about the burden he's carried, the cross he's borne, the wife who betrayed him and left him with a constant reminder of her sins. That reminder is me, Alara Vance. 34 years old, and still, in this house, I am not a daughter. I am a punishment. I dry my hands on a dish towel and watch through the doorway as my father lifts his glass. He's 71 now, still handsome in the hard, weathered way of men who've spent their lives being right about everything. His voice deepens, the way it always does when he's about to say the words that have defined my entire existence. "I've raised her," he says, not looking at me. He never looks at me when he says it. All these years, I've raised the affair child like she was my own. Because I'm a good man. Because I made a promise to God. The relatives murmur their approval. My Aunt Celia presses her hand to her heart. My cousin Brent nods solemnly. The way you nod at a sermon you've heard 100 times and still pretend moves you. And I stand in the kitchen doorway, holding a dish towel. And I don't cry. I haven't cried in this house since I was 9 years old, and I figured out that tears only made him louder. Welcome to Alicia Daily Stories, where the truth never stays buried and the quiet ones always find their voice. If you've ever been cast as the villain in a story you never agreed to star in, settle in. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and subscribe so you don't miss the moment everything changes. Because everything was about to change. I just didn't know it yet. The woman who would bring my father to his knees was already on her way, driving down a 2-lane highway with a manila folder on her passenger seat and 28 years of secrets in her chest. But before I tell you about her, I need to tell you about the night I was born. Or rather, the night my father says I was born, because those are two very different things. My mother's name was Clara Vance, and she died when I was 6 days old. A hemorrhage, the doctor said. Something that should have been caught, should have been fixed, but wasn't. She bled out in this very house, in the upstairs bedroom where my father still sleeps, while my grandmother held me in the kitchen and prayed. I know almost nothing about her. My father burned her photographs when I was 3. He said he didn't want the affair child staring at the face of the woman who'd ruined his life. I've spent 34 years trying to piece her together from the things he's let slip. The things my grandmother whispered before she died. The handful of scraps I've managed to collect in secret. Here's what I know. She was a nurse. She worked at County General, the same hospital where I was born. She had dark hair like mine and, according to my grandmother, a laugh that could fill a room. She married my father in 1988, and by 1990, according to him, she was already pregnant with another man's child. The other man was a doctor. That's the story anyway. A doctor she worked with at the hospital. My father has never told me his name. He says he doesn't know it, that my mother took that secret to her grave. But he's certain the man existed. He's been certain for 28 years. The timing was the proof, he says. He was away on business when I was conceived. A construction job in another state, 3 months long. He came home, and my mother was already pregnant, already glowing, already carrying a child that couldn't possibly be his. I've done the math 1,000 times. I've sat in my apartment in the city, 2 hours from this house, and I've counted backward from my birthday. I've read about gestational age and conception windows and the way due dates are calculated. And every time, I've come to the same conclusion. The math doesn't add up the way my father says it does. But you don't argue with Raymond Vance. Not about this. Not about anything. My father is a man who has built his entire identity around being the wronged party, the faithful husband who raised a bastard child out of the goodness of his heart. If you take that away from him, you take everything. So I stopped arguing when I was 12. I stopped asking questions when I was 16. I learned to be quiet, to be small, to be grateful in the way he expected me to be grateful. I learned to call him Dad and to accept the way his voice hardened when he said my name. And I learned, most of all, to carry the shame that wasn't mine. The Father's Day party had been going for 2 hours, and I was already calculating how soon I could leave. These gatherings are a choreography I know by heart. I arrive late enough to avoid the setup, but early enough to avoid the comments about being late. I bring a dish I know no one will eat. I position myself at the edge of every conversation, present but not participating, the way a ghost haunts a room without touching anything. My sister Margot was holding court at the dining table. She's 5 years younger than me, the legitimate daughter, the one my father had with his second wife. Margot got the childhood I didn't. The birthday parties, the proud father-daughter photos, the casual affection I used to watch from doorways like a child pressing her face against a bakery window. She's not cruel, exactly. She's just never needed to question the story our father tells. Why would she? She's the hero of it. The proof that Raymond Vance could move on, could build something pure after the betrayal. I'm the footnote. The stain. The thing that happened before her story started. Ilara, my father called from the head of the table. Come here. I set down the dish towel and walked into the dining room. The relatives watched me pass, the way people watch a car accident they can't look away from. They've been watching me like that my whole life. I was just telling everyone, my father said, about the sacrifice I made for you. That word, sacrifice. He uses it like a weapon, and he always has. I could have sent you to foster care, he said, loud enough for the whole table to hear. I could have let the state take you. Lord knows you weren't my responsibility. But I didn't. I kept you. I fed you. I put clothes on your back and a roof over your head. And I've never asked for a single thank you. He looked at me then, his eyes hard and expectant. This was the part where I was supposed to perform gratitude, where I was supposed to bow my head and say, "Thank you, Dad, for everything you've done for me." I've done it before, dozens of times, hundreds. But something in me had shifted in the past year. Maybe it was turning 34 and realizing I'd spent more than half my life apologizing for being born. Maybe it was the therapy I'd finally started, the kind where a calm woman with a notepad helps you understand that the voice in your head calling you worthless isn't actually yours. Or maybe it was the envelope I'd received 3 weeks ago, the one I hadn't told anyone about, the one that had sent me down a path I was still walking, gathering pieces of a truth I didn't yet fully understand. I've thanked you, Dad, I said quietly. Many times. Not enough, he said. Not nearly enough. An affair child can never thank the man who raised her enough. There it was. The phrase. The affair child. He's been calling me that since I was old enough to understand what the words meant. He uses it the way other fathers use sweetheart or honey. It's his name for me. His brand. I felt the familiar heat rise in my chest, the shame and the anger tangled together so tightly I couldn't tell them apart. But underneath it, for the first time, there was something else. Something cold and still and patient. Because I knew something my father didn't. I knew that the story he'd been telling for 28 years was about to meet a woman who could prove it was a lie. Her name was Patricia Donnelly, and she'd been a nurse at County General for 42 years before she retired. She'd worked the maternity ward. She'd been there the night I was born. And 3 weeks ago, she'd sent me a letter. I found it in my mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon, a plain white envelope with my name handwritten across the front in shaky cursive. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a photograph. The photograph was of a woman I didn't recognize. Dark hair, tired eyes, a newborn cradled against her chest. She was smiling, but it was the smile of someone who'd been through something hard and was still standing. On the back, in the same shaky handwriting, were 2 words, "Your mother." I stared at that photograph for an hour. I'd never seen my mother's face before. My father had made sure of that. And now, at 34 years old, I was looking at her for the first time, and she was looking back at me, and I felt something crack open in my chest that I'd been keeping sealed shut since I was a child. The letter was brief. Patricia Donnelly introduced herself as a retired nurse who'd been present at my birth. She said she'd thought about reaching out for years but hadn't known how. She said she was getting older, and her health wasn't what it used to be, and there were things she needed to tell me before it was too late. "Your mother was a good woman," the letter said. "She loved you more than anything. And she told me something before she died that I've carried for 28 years. Something your father has never known. Something you deserve to hear from someone who was there." Patricia Donnelly had included her phone number and an address in a small town about 3 hours from where I lived. She said she'd understand if I didn't call, if I didn't want to know. But she said she hoped I would. I called her the next day. We talked for 2 hours. And by the end of that conversation, I understood that everything I thought I knew about my life was wrong. But I didn't tell my father. I didn't tell anyone. I made a plan instead. A quiet plan. The kind you make when you've spent your whole life learning that the loudest person in the room isn't always the one telling the truth. Patricia Donnelly was coming to Father's Day. I'd arranged it all in secret. She was going to arrive at 3 p.m., right in the middle of the party, right when my father was at his most performative. I didn't know exactly what she was going to say. She'd told me she had something to show him, something that would prove everything he believed was wrong. She'd been vague about the details, and I'd been too afraid to push, but I trusted her. I'd heard the conviction in her voice, the weight of 28 years of silence finally breaking. She'd been my mother's friend. She'd held my mother's hand while she bled. She'd promised her something all those years ago, and now she was coming to keep that promise. The clock on the dining room wall read 2:47. 13 minutes. My father was still talking. He'd moved on from me, mercifully, and was now telling a story about his construction business, something about a client who'd tried to cheat him and lived to regret it. The relatives were nodding along, their plates clean, their glasses refilled. I slipped away to the kitchen and checked my phone. Patricia had texted me an hour ago. "On my way. See you soon." I typed back, "I'm ready." But I wasn't ready. Not really. How do you prepare for the moment your entire history gets rewritten? How do you stand in the house where you were called a disgrace for 28 years and wait for a stranger to walk through the door and tell everyone they were wrong? I looked out the kitchen window at the backyard. The same backyard where I'd played as a child. Always at the edges. Always careful not to get in the way. The same oak tree where I'd sat and read books by myself while Margot and her friends played games I wasn't invited to join. The same fence my father had painted the summer I turned 10. The summer he'd looked at me across the dinner table and said, "You have her eyes. Her lying eyes." My mother's eyes. The only thing I had of hers, and even that was used against me. I turned away from the window and checked the time again. 2:52, 8 minutes. I'd spent the past 3 weeks doing something I'd never done before. I'd started asking questions. Quietly, carefully, the way I'd learned to do everything in this family. I'd called County General and requested my birth records. I'd searched online for information about the doctor my father claimed was my biological father. I'd even contacted a DNA testing company, though I hadn't sent in my sample yet. I was waiting for Patricia, waiting for whatever she was bringing. And while I waited, I'd learned something that had made my blood run cold. The doctor my father had always hinted at, the man he claimed was my mother's lover, had existed. His name was Dr. Alan Whitmore, and he'd worked in the maternity ward at County General in the late 1980s. But he hadn't just worked there. He'd been the head of the department, a respected physician, a married man with children of his own. And in 1991, 6 months after I was born, Dr. Alan Whitmore had been fired from County General for reasons the hospital refused to disclose. I'd found all of this in a newspaper archive, buried in the local section of a paper that no longer existed. The article was brief, almost deliberately vague. Dr. Alan Whitmore, head of obstetrics at County General, has been relieved of his duties pending an internal investigation. Hospital administrators declined to comment on the nature of the investigation. That was it. No follow-up, no resolution. Just a man who'd lost his job and disappeared from the public record. But the timing haunted me. 6 months after I was born. 6 months after my mother died. What had happened at that hospital? What had Dr. Whitmore done? And why had Patricia Donnelly chosen now, after 28 years of silence, to finally speak? I had theories. Dark ones. But I wouldn't know the truth until she walked through the door. 2:58. 2 minutes. I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. My father didn't notice. He was still telling his story, his voice rising and falling with the rhythm of a man who loved the sound of his own authority. I walked to the front door and opened it. The woman standing on the porch was smaller than I'd expected. Patricia Donnelly was in her late 70s, with white hair pulled back in a neat bun and glasses that magnified her eyes. She carried a worn leather bag over one shoulder and a manila folder clutched against her chest. Her face was lined but kind, and when she saw me, her eyes filled with tears. "Ilara," she said, "you look just like her." I couldn't speak. I just nodded and stepped aside to let her in. She walked past me into the foyer, her footsteps steady despite her age. She looked around at the house, at the family photographs on the walls, the ones I wasn't in. Her mouth tightened. "He never put up a picture of your mother, did he?" she asked quietly. "No," I said. "He burned them." She closed her eyes for a moment, and I saw something pass across her face. Grief, maybe, or anger, or both. "Then it's time," she said, "to set the record straight." She walked toward the dining room, and I followed her. My father was mid-sentence when she appeared in the doorway. He stopped talking. The whole table stopped talking. Everyone turned to look at this stranger, this elderly woman who'd walked uninvited into a family gathering with a folder in her hands and a purpose in her eyes. "Raymond Vance," Patricia said, and her voice was clear and strong, the voice of a woman who'd spent decades in hospital rooms telling people hard truths. "Do you remember me?" My father stared at her. His face went through a series of expressions I'd never seen on him before. Confusion, then recognition, then something that looked almost like fear. "Patricia," he said. "Patricia Donnelly?" "That's right," she said. "I was there the night your wife died. I was there the night Ilara was born. And I'm here now because I made a promise to Clara that I've waited 28 years to keep." She opened the manila folder and pulled out a document. It was old, yellowed at the edges, covered in official-looking stamps and signatures. My father's face went pale. "What is that?" he said. Patricia Donnelly looked at him, and then she looked at me, and then she said the words that would bring my father to his knees. "This," she said, "is the truth." She held up the document so everyone could see it. And my father, Raymond Vance, the man who'd called me an affair child for 28 years, took one look at it and collapsed on the floor. The sound my father made when he hit the floor was something I will never forget. Not a scream, not a groan, but a kind of hollow thud, the sound of a body that had gone completely limp. His chair tipped sideways, and then he was just there, sprawled on the dining room floor, one arm flung out toward the table leg, his face the color of old newspaper. For one long, frozen moment, nobody moved. The relatives sat in their chairs like wax figures. Aunt Celia had her hand still pressed to her chest, but the piety had drained out of the gesture. My sister Margot was the first to react, pushing back her chair with a scrape that cut through the silence. "Dad!" she screamed, and dropped to her knees beside him. That broke the spell. Suddenly the room was full of movement. Cousin Brent was on his phone calling 911. Aunt Celia was fanning my father with a napkin. Someone shouted for water, for smelling salts, for someone to do something. The whole careful choreography of the Father's Day party shattered into chaos. And I stood in the doorway, next to Patricia Donnelly, watching it all happen as if from a great distance. I should have rushed to his side. I should have been the dutiful daughter, the one who'd spent 34 years performing gratitude for a man who'd never once called me by a loving name. But my feet wouldn't move. Something had locked inside me the moment he fell, some mechanism that had been holding me together for decades and had finally, mercifully, released. Patricia Donnelly reached over and took my hand. Her grip was dry and warm and surprisingly strong. "He's not having a heart attack," she said quietly, so only I could hear. "He's having a reckoning. There's a difference." I looked at her. Her eyes were steady behind her glasses, the eyes of a woman who had seen men like my father before and was not impressed by their collapses. "What's in the folder?" I whispered. She pressed it into my hands. The manila was soft from years of handling, the edges worn, the metal clasp cold against my fingers. "Everything your mother wanted you to know," she said. "Read it. Now. While he can't stop you." I looked down at the folder. Then I looked at my father on the floor, surrounded by the family he'd spent 28 years performing for. Margot was crying. Aunt Celia was praying. Cousin Brent was talking to the dispatcher in a voice pitched high with panic. And I opened the folder. The first thing I saw was a birth certificate. My birth certificate. Elara Jean Vance, born March 14, 1990, at County General Hospital. Mother, Clara Jean Vance. Father, Raymond Thomas Vance. I'd seen my birth certificate before. I'd needed it for a passport when I was 22, and my father had produced it from a locked drawer in his study, reluctantly, as if letting me touch it might contaminate the document. But this one was different. This one had an additional stamp in the bottom corner, a notary seal I didn't recognize, and a handwritten note in blue ink. Paternity confirmed by blood test, 03-21-1990. I stared at those words. Paternity confirmed. March 21st, 1990, 7 days after I was born. 7 days after my mother died. The second document was the blood test itself. It was on County General letterhead, typed on an old-fashioned typewriter, the letters slightly uneven. It listed my blood type, my mother's blood type, and my father's blood type. At the bottom, in bold capital letters, were the words, "Conclusion. Raymond T. Vance cannot be excluded as the biological father of Elara J. Vance. Probability of paternity, 99.97%. My hands started to shake. I read the words again, and again, and again. My father had known. He had known since I was 7 days old that I was his biological daughter. He had sat in this house, in this very dining room, and called me an affair child for 28 years, knowing it was a lie. He had let me believe I was the product of my mother's betrayal. He had let me carry the shame, the confusion, the desperate longing for a father who would never fully love me. And he had known. The third document was a letter. Handwritten, on hospital stationery, dated March 20th, 1990. The day before the blood test. The day before my mother died. I recognized the handwriting from the photograph Patricia had sent me. My mother's handwriting. Shaky but determined, the letters slanting forward as if in a hurry. "To whomever finds this," it began, "my name is Clara Vance, and I am afraid that I am going to die." I stopped breathing. "I have been bleeding since the delivery," the letter continued, "and the doctors keep telling me it's normal. But I know it's not normal. I'm a nurse. I've worked in this hospital for 6 years. I know when something is wrong. And something is wrong. My husband Raymond came to see me yesterday. He told me he's requested a paternity test for the baby. He told me he knows she isn't his. He's been saying this for months, ever since he came back from his job in Ohio and found out I was pregnant. The job he took 3 months before I conceived, even though I begged him not to go. The job that was supposed to prove I was unfaithful. I was never unfaithful. Elara is his daughter. I have never been with another man in my entire marriage. But Raymond doesn't believe me. He says the timing doesn't work. He says he'll prove it with science. He says when the test comes back, he'll make sure everyone knows what kind of woman I am. I begged the nurse, Patricia, to help me. She's been kind to me. She's the only one who listens. I asked her to make sure the test is done properly, to make sure the results are recorded, to make sure my daughter knows the truth someday. Patricia promised me she would. If you are reading this, and if I am gone, please know that I loved my daughter. Please know that I never betrayed my marriage. Please know that whatever Raymond says, Ilara is his child, his daughter, his flesh and blood. Please take care of her. Please tell her the truth. Clara Vance. Tears were streaming down my face before I finished the letter. I couldn't stop them. I didn't try. For 28 years, I had been the affair child, the disgrace, the constant reminder of a betrayal that had never happened. For 28 years, I had believed my father was a wronged man, a victim of my mother's infidelity, a saint who'd raised another man's child out of the goodness of his heart. And the whole time, he had known. He had the blood test. He had the proof. He had my mother's letter, or at least he'd known she'd written one. And he had chosen, deliberately, cruelly, relentlessly, to lie. I looked up from the folder. My father was still on the floor, but his eyes were open now. Margot was helping him sit up, her arm around his shoulders. Aunt Celia was pressing a glass of water into his hand. The paramedics hadn't arrived yet, but he was clearly conscious, clearly aware, clearly seeing me standing in the doorway with the folder in my hands. Our eyes met, and I saw it. The fear, the knowledge, the dawning understanding that the lie he'd built his entire identity around was crumbling in front of everyone who'd ever believed it. "Ilara," he said, and his voice was weak, but the command was still there, the old reflex. "Give me that folder." I didn't move. "Ilara," he said again, louder this time. "That's private. Give it to me. Now." I looked at Patricia Donnelly. She nodded once, a small, firm movement of her chin. "Go ahead," it said. "This is your moment." I walked across the dining room, past my frozen relatives, past my sister who was staring at me with an expression I couldn't read, and I stopped a few feet from my father. "You knew," I said. My voice came out steady, which surprised me. "You've known since I was a week old that I was your daughter." The room went completely silent. Even Aunt Celia stopped her praying. My father's face contorted. "That's a lie," he said. "Whatever she told you, whatever she put in that folder, it's a lie. Your mother was a—" "Don't," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "Don't say another word about my mother." I held up the blood test. "This is a paternity test from County General, dated March 21st, 1990, 7 days after I was born. It says you are my biological father with 99.97% probability. It has your signature on the request form. It has the hospital's stamp. It's notarized." I held up the birth certificate. "This is my birth certificate. It lists you as my father. It says paternity was confirmed by blood test." I held up my mother's letter. "And this is a letter from my mother, written the day before she died, begging someone to tell me the truth. She knew you were going to lie. She knew you were going to use that paternity test to destroy her memory and punish me for being born. She was dying, and she was afraid. And she wrote this letter asking a stranger to do what her own husband refused to do." I looked at my father. He was gray-faced now, his mouth opening and closing, no words coming out. "You've called me an affair child for 28 years, I said. "You've humiliated me in front of this family, in front of neighbors, in front of anyone who would listen. You've made me believe I was unworthy of your love because of something my mother supposedly did. And the whole time, you knew it wasn't true." "That's not," he started. "You knew," I said, and now my voice did rise, just a little. "You knew she didn't betray you. You knew I was your daughter. You knew, and you chose to lie. Every single day for 28 years you chose to lie. Margot was staring at our father now, her face pale. "Dad?" she said. "Is that true?" He didn't answer. He just kept looking at me, his eyes darting between my face and the documents in my hands, as if he could somehow will them out of existence. Patricia Donnelly stepped forward. "It's true," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "I was there. I drew the blood for that test myself. I watched the results come back. And I watched your father take those results, read them, and then tell the hospital administrator that there'd been a mistake. He tried to get the test thrown out. He tried to get the records sealed. When the administrator refused, he took the copy they gave him, and he buried it." She looked at my father with something that was not quite contempt and not quite pity. "You thought you'd destroyed all the evidence, didn't you, Raymond? You thought no one else had kept a copy. But Clara asked me to keep one. She made me promise. And I've kept that promise for 28 years. My father found his voice at last. It was hoarse and cracked, the voice of a man who'd been screaming, though he hadn't made a sound. "You had no right," he said. "No right to come into my house and—" "I had every right," Patricia said calmly. "I made a promise to a dying woman. A good woman. A woman who loved her daughter more than anything in this world. A woman whose husband was so consumed by his own paranoia that he let her die alone and afraid, and then spent the next 28 years punishing her child for a sin she never committed." The room was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking on the mantelpiece. The paramedics still hadn't arrived. No one was calling for them anymore. No one was moving. "I didn't let her die," my father said, but his voice had gone thin and defensive. "You did," Patricia said. "She told the doctors she was still bleeding. They dismissed her. And when she called you from the hospital, begging you to come, begging you to advocate for her, you told her you were too busy. You told her you'd come when the paternity test results were in. You told her you'd come when you had proof of what kind of woman she was." She paused. And when she spoke again, her voice was quieter, but no less devastating. "She died the next day, Raymond. She hemorrhaged in her hospital bed while the nurses were at lunch. By the time they found her, she'd lost too much blood. She was 27 years old. She left behind a 6-day-old baby and a husband who'd refused to visit her because he was waiting for a test that would prove he was wrong." I felt the tears come again, hot and silent. My mother had died alone. She had bled to death in a hospital bed, and my father had stayed away, nursing his paranoia, waiting for proof of a betrayal that had never happened. And when the proof came, when the test showed what he should have known all along, he'd buried it. He'd chosen the lie. He'd chosen the story that made him the victim, the martyr, the noble man raising another man's child. Because that story was more comfortable than the truth that he'd let his wife die, the truth that he'd failed her when she needed him most, the truth that he was not the wronged husband, but the man who'd wronged everyone around him. "Why?" I heard myself ask. "Why did you do it?" My father looked up at me, and for just a moment, the mask slipped. I saw something in his face I'd never seen before. Not anger, not pride. Something closer to shame, raw and ugly and terrible. But he didn't answer. He couldn't. Because there was no answer that could make sense of 28 years of cruelty. No justification that could balance the scales. The front door burst open. The paramedics had arrived, 2 young men in uniforms carrying equipment. They took in the scene, the man on the floor, the woman standing over him with papers in her hands, the circle of relatives frozen in their chairs. "Sir, are you all right?" one of them asked, kneeling beside my father. My father looked at him and then back at me. "I'm fine," he said, but his voice was shaking. "I'm fine. I just need a minute." The paramedic checked his pulse anyway, his blood pressure, the dilation of his pupils. I watched them work, and I thought about my mother dying in a hospital bed, bleeding out while the staff was away, while her husband stayed home. Patricia Donnelly touched my arm. "Come outside with me," she said quietly. You need air. I nodded. I couldn't speak anymore. I let her lead me out of the dining room, past the relatives who stared at us like we were ghosts, past the paramedics who were helping my father to his feet, past the table where my uneaten plate of food was still sitting, cold and forgotten. The backyard was empty. The citronella candles were still burning on the patio, their flames dancing in the late afternoon breeze. I walked to the oak tree and sat down on the bench beneath it. The same bench where I'd sat 1,000 times as a child, reading books and hiding from a family that didn't want me. Patricia sat beside me. She didn't speak. She just sat there, a quiet presence, the way she must have sat with my mother 28 years ago. She knew, I said finally. My mother knew he would lie about the test. She suspected, Patricia said. She'd been married to him for 3 years. She knew what he was capable of. When she wrote that letter, she was terrified. Not of dying. She'd made her peace with that possibility. She was terrified that her daughter would grow up believing she was something she wasn't. I looked down at the folder in my lap. She asked you to keep a copy of the test. She asked me to make sure you knew the truth. I wanted to tell you sooner. I tried. But your father moved you away from the hospital, changed his phone number, cut off contact with everyone who'd known your mother. By the time I could track you down, you were already grown, and I didn't know how to approach you. I didn't know if you'd believe me. Why now? I asked. Patricia was quiet for a moment. I'm 78 years old, she said. I've had 2 heart attacks. My doctor says the next one might be the last. I couldn't die with this secret still inside me. I couldn't face your mother in the next life and tell her I'd failed. I turned to look at her. In the fading afternoon light, her face was lined and tired, but her eyes were clear. You didn't fail, I said. You kept your promise. She smiled, a small, sad smile. I hope so, she said. I hope it's enough. We sat in silence for a while. From inside the house, I could hear the murmur of voices, the paramedics packing up their equipment, the family trying to process what had just happened. I didn't want to go back inside. I didn't want to face any of them. But I knew I would have to. There were still questions to answer, still conversations to have, still the long, slow work of rebuilding a life that had been built on a lie. Patricia, I said, do you know why? Why he lied about the paternity test? Why he spent 28 years calling me an affair child when he knew I was his? Patricia looked at me for a long moment. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out one more document. It was a photocopy of a hospital record, dated the day after my mother died. I think, she said, this might help explain. I took the paper. It was a report from the hospital's risk management department. The subject line read, Internal Review, Maternal Death, Clara Vance. And as I read it, I understood at last what my father had been hiding. Not just the truth about my paternity. Something darker. Something that went all the way back to the night I was born. The hospital report was dated March 21st, 1990, the day after my mother died. It was typed on the same uneven typewriter as the paternity test, the letters pressing deep into the paper, as if the person writing it had been angry, or afraid, or both. I read it slowly, my eyes straining in the fading light. Patricia sat beside me, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the oak tree as if she were seeing something else entirely. Something from 28 years ago. The report was labeled Internal Review, Sentinel Event, Maternal Mortality, Clara Vance, 11/04/1962. Below that, in smaller type, were the words, Confidential, for risk management use only. Do not copy, do not distribute. Someone had clearly ignored that instruction. Patricia had kept this document hidden for nearly 3 decades. I started reading the summary at the top of the first page. Patient Clara Vance, age 27, Gravida 1 Para 1, was admitted to County General Hospital on March 14, 1990, at 38 weeks gestation, in active labor. Delivery was vaginal, uncomplicated, with the birth of a healthy female infant at 11:47 p.m. Estimated blood loss during delivery was recorded as 450 milliliter, within normal parameters. Normal. The birth had been normal. I was healthy. My mother was healthy. Everything should have been fine. During the postpartum period, the patient experienced persistent vaginal bleeding that was documented by nursing staff on 3 separate occasions between March 15th and March 19th. On March 15th, the patient reported soaking through multiple pads per hour. The attending physician, Dr. Alan Whitmore, was notified and ordered a complete blood count. Results showed a hemoglobin drop from 12.8 GDL to 9.1 GDL, indicating significant blood loss. No further intervention was ordered. I stopped reading and looked at Patricia. She was bleeding for 4 days and no one did anything? Patricia's jaw tightened. Keep reading. I turned back to the report. On March 16th, nursing staff again documented heavy bleeding and expressed concern to Dr. Whitmore. Dr. Whitmore noted in the chart that the bleeding was within expected range for postpartum patients and did not order additional testing. On March 17th, the patient requested to speak with the hospital administrator regarding her care. This request was relayed to the nursing supervisor, but was not acted upon. The next paragraph made my stomach turn. On March 18th, the patient contacted her husband, Raymond Vance, by telephone and requested that he come to the hospital to assist with advocating for her care. Mr. Vance, according to the patient's own statements to nursing staff, declined to come, stating that he was waiting for test results before he would return to the hospital. The patient became increasingly distressed following this conversation. Nursing notes indicate elevated blood pressure and tachycardia. He wouldn't come. She was bleeding, she was scared, she was asking for help, and my father wouldn't come because he was waiting for the paternity test. The test he'd demanded. The test he was so certain would prove her betrayal. On March 19th at approximately 3:15 p.m., the patient experienced a sudden and severe hemorrhage. The nursing staff on duty, which consisted of 1 RN responsible for 14 postpartum patients, did not discover the hemorrhage until approximately 3:40 p.m., when a routine vital signs check was conducted. At that time, the patient was found unresponsive, with blood loss estimated at $2,000 milliliter or more. Emergency interventions were initiated, including blood transfusion and emergency hysterectomy, but the patient was unable to be resuscitated. She was pronounced dead at 4:12 p.m., 14 patients, 1 nurse. And my mother had bled to death while no one was watching. I was shaking now, the paper trembling in my hands. Patricia reached over and steadied it for me. "There's more," she said quietly. "The findings." I turned to the second page. It was titled, Root Cause Analysis Findings. Finding 1, Dr. Alan Whitmore, the attending physician, failed to respond appropriately to repeated nursing reports of postpartum hemorrhage. His failure to order diagnostic imaging, surgical consultation, or additional laboratory testing constituted a deviation from the standard of care. Finding 2, the hospital's nurse-to-patient ratio on the postpartum unit on March 19, 1990, was 1:14, which exceeded the recommended ratio of 1.6 and contributed to the delayed discovery of the patient's hemorrhage. Finding 3, the patient's husband, Raymond Vance, was contacted by hospital staff on 4 occasions between March 18th and March 19th, requesting that he come to the hospital to provide informed consent for potential surgical intervention. Mr. Vance declined on all 4 occasions. On the final call, placed at 2:45 p.m. on March 19th, Mr. Vance reportedly told the nursing supervisor that he would come when I'm ready, and terminated the call. The patient was discovered hemorrhaging 30 minutes later. 4 calls. They'd called him 4 times, and he'd refused every single one. He'd said he would come when he was ready, and by the time he was ready, my mother was dead. Finding 4, the paternity test requested by Mr. Raymond Vance was completed on March 21, 1990. and confirmed that Mr. Vance is the biological father of the infant Alara Vance with 99.97% probability. Mr. Vance was notified of these results by telephone on March 21st. According to the staff member who placed the call, Mr. Vance's initial response was silence, followed by the statement, "That can't be right. Do it again." He was informed that the test had been verified and was final. I could picture him, standing in this house, holding the phone, hearing the words that proved everything he'd believed was wrong. Silence. That can't be right. Do it again. Not grief, not horror at what he'd done, just refusal, denial. The same stubborn, immovable denial he'd aimed at me my whole life. Finding 5. Following the confirmation of paternity, Mr. Vance contacted the hospital's legal department and threatened litigation, alleging that the hospital's negligence had caused his wife's death. The hospital's risk management team negotiated a settlement agreement with Mr. Vance in the amount of $475,000. As a condition of the settlement, Mr. Vance signed a non-disclosure agreement prohibiting him from discussing the details of his wife's death publicly. The settlement agreement also included a clause stating that the hospital would not publicly disclose the findings of the internal review, including Dr. Whitmore's role in the patient's death. $475,000. My father had been paid for my mother's death. He'd taken the hospital's money and signed away the right to ever speak about what had really happened. And then he'd buried the paternity test, buried the truth, and spent the next 28 years calling me an affair child. I lowered the paper. My hands were no longer shaking. They'd gone completely still, the way they do when a feeling is too big to fit inside a body. "He took the money," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, flat, disconnected. "He let them cover up what happened to her, and he took the money." Patricia nodded. "He used it to pay off this house. I checked the property records before I came. The mortgage was paid in full in June of 1990, 3 months after your mother died. He told everyone he'd worked extra jobs to save the house. But I knew. I knew where that money came from." I stared at her. "You knew all of this? For 28 years you knew?" "I knew pieces of it," Patricia said. "I knew about the paternity test because I was there when it was drawn. I knew about the settlement because I heard the nurses talking about it afterward. But I didn't have the full picture until later. I didn't have the report until after I retired and a former colleague sent it to me. She'd kept a copy against the hospital's orders. She thought someone should have it. Someone who might be able to do something with it someday." I looked back at the report. The words were starting to blur together, but one phrase kept jumping out at me. The patient contacted her husband by telephone and requested that he come to the hospital. Mr. Vance declined to come. The hospital called 4 times. Mr. Vance declined on all 4 occasions. My mother had been alone, bleeding, terrified, and the one person who should have been there, the one person who could have demanded the doctors listen, could have insisted on more testing, could have held her hand and called the administrator and refused to leave until someone helped her. That person had stayed home, waiting for a test that would prove his own paranoia wrong. And when the test came back, when he learned the truth, he didn't fall to his knees. He didn't weep. He didn't rush to the hospital to hold his newborn daughter. He said, "That can't be right. Do it again." And then he called a lawyer. He didn't want to know, I said, more to myself than to Patricia. He didn't want the test to be right. He wanted her to have betrayed him. He wanted me not to be his. Because if I was his, then everything he'd done. I couldn't finish the sentence. I didn't have to. Patricia understood. "If you were his," she said gently, "then he'd let his wife die for nothing. He'd refuse to come to the hospital for nothing. He'd spent months accusing an innocent woman of something she never did. He'd destroyed his marriage over a fear that had no basis in reality. If you were his, then there was no justification. No excuse. Just a man who failed his wife in the worst possible way and couldn't face what he'd done." "So he chose the lie," I said. "He chose to believe I wasn't his, Even with the test in front of him, he chose the lie. It was easier, Patricia said. He could be the victim, the wronged husband, the noble man who raised another man's child. He could tell that story to himself and to everyone else, and he could almost believe it. If he admitted the truth, he'd have to admit that Clara's death was preventable, and that his refusal to come to the hospital contributed to it. He'd have to live with that guilt. And Raymond Vance is not a man who can live with guilt. I thought about my father, the way he'd performed his sacrifice at every family gathering for 28 years. The trembling voice, the heavy sighs, the long pauses where he waited for someone to comfort him. He'd built an entire identity around being the victim. And underneath that identity was a man who'd ignored 4 phone calls while his wife bled to death. Why didn't the hospital do more? I asked. Why didn't anyone call the police, or another family member, or just do the surgery without his consent? Patricia shook her head. It was 1990. Things were different then. The hospital was terrified of a lawsuit, which they ended up facing anyway. And they were understaffed, underfunded, cutting corners wherever they could. Dr. Whitmore should have been held accountable, and he eventually was in a way. He was fired 6 months later after another patient nearly died under similar circumstances. But by then, your father had already signed the settlement. The truth was already buried. I folded the report carefully and put it back in the folder with the paternity test and the birth certificate and my mother's letter. 4 documents, 4 pieces of paper, and they contained the entire truth of my life, a truth that had been hidden from me since I was 6 days old. I need to go back inside, I said. Patricia looked at me with concern. Are you sure? You don't have to do this now. You can take the documents and leave. You can talk to a lawyer. You can decide what you want to do when you're ready. No, I said. I've been waiting 34 years to be ready. If I leave now, I'll never come back. And he'll find a way to spin this. He always finds a way. He'll tell everyone Patricia was a crazy old woman with a grudge. He'll say the documents were forged. He'll make himself the victim again, and half the family will believe him because they want to believe him. I stood up from the bench. The citronella candles were still burning on the patio, their flames small and steady against the gathering dusk. Through the kitchen window, I could see the family still gathered in the dining room. The paramedics were gone. My father was back in his chair at the head of the table, a glass of water in front of him, his face still gray but composed. He was talking to someone. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I could see the expressions on the faces around him. Confusion, concern. The beginning of the familiar rhythm, the rhythm of my father telling a story and everyone nodding along. Not this time. I walked toward the house, Patricia following a few steps behind. The back door opened into the kitchen, and as I stepped inside, the smell of barbecue and cake and coffee hit me. The same smells that had been filling this house on Father's Day for as long as I could remember. But they smelled different now. They smelled like the last day of something. I walked through the kitchen and into the dining room. The conversation stopped. Every face turned toward me. My father looked up from his chair, and for just a moment, I saw fear flicker across his features before he smoothed it away. "Ilara," he said, and his voice was almost normal now, almost the voice of the patriarch again. "I think we've all had enough drama for one afternoon. Why don't you sit down and we can discuss this calmly, like adults?" "Discuss what, Dad?" I said. I used the word deliberately. Dad. The word I'd called him my whole life. The word he'd never once deserved. Discuss the paternity test you hid for 28 years? Or discuss the phone calls you ignored while my mother was dying? The room went very still. My sister Margot was staring at me, her face pale. Aunt Celia had her hand over her mouth. The cousins were exchanging glances, unsure whether to stay or flee. "I don't know what you're talking about," my father said, but his voice had gone tight. I held up the risk management report. "This is a hospital document from 1990. It says you were called 4 times on the day Mom died. 4 times. They needed your consent for emergency surgery, and you refused to come. You told them you'd come when you were ready, and by the time you were ready, she was dead." "That's a lie," he said, but the word had no force behind it. "It's not a lie," Patricia said, stepping into the room behind me. "I was there, Raymond. I was the one who called you the third time. I heard your voice. You said, and I quote, 'I'll come when I'm ready. Stop calling me.' And then you hung up." My father's face went through a series of expressions I'd never seen on him before. Anger, yes, but also something else. Something that looked almost like grief. Almost like the truth was finally pushing its way out of him after 28 years of being held down. "You took the settlement," I said. $475,000. You signed a non-disclosure agreement, and you paid off this house, and you told everyone you'd worked extra jobs. And then you spent the next 28 years calling me an affair child because if you admitted I was yours, you'd have to admit what you did." "Ilara," Margot started, but I held up my hand to stop her. "No," I said. "No more protecting him. No more pretending. He's been lying to all of us. To me, to you, to everyone in this room. He let our mother die alone in a hospital bed because he was too busy nursing his own paranoia. And when the proof came that he was wrong, he buried it and built his whole life on the lie." I looked at my father. He was gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white. The gray color was back in his face, and for a moment I thought he might collapse again. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Not anymore. "You want to know why I came today?" I said. "I came because a woman I'd never met sent me a letter 3 weeks ago. A woman who'd been carrying the truth for 28 years because my mother asked her to. And I came because I was finally ready to hear it. I was finally ready to stop being the affair child and start being the daughter of a woman who loved me. A woman who died alone because her husband wouldn't answer the phone." I set the folder down on the table in front of him. "Here," I said. "Here's everything. The paternity test, the hospital report, the settlement agreement. All of it. Read it, or don't. I don't care anymore. But I'm done. I'm done carrying your shame. I'm done being the disgrace. And I'm done calling you Dad." The room was silent. My father stared at the folder like it was a snake coiled on his dining room table. His mouth opened, but no words came out. And then slowly, like a man moving through water, he reached for the folder. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely open it. He pulled out the first document, the paternity test, and looked at it for a long moment. Then he pulled out the hospital report. And then he did something I had never seen him do in my entire life. He started to cry. Not the performative tears he'd used at my mother's funeral, the ones that had impressed all the relatives and earned him 100 sympathetic pats on the back. Real tears. Ugly tears. The tears of a man who'd spent 28 years running from a truth that had finally caught up with him. "I didn't mean for her to die," he said, and his voice was so small, so broken, that I almost didn't recognize it. I didn't know. I didn't know she was bleeding that badly. I thought she was exaggerating. I thought it was a ploy to get me to come to the hospital before the test results came back. I thought... He stopped. He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. We all knew what he'd thought. He'd thought his wife was a liar. He'd thought she was a cheater. He'd thought she'd do anything, say anything to manipulate him. And so he'd ignored her cries for help, and she'd died, and he'd spent every day since trying to convince himself it wasn't his fault. "I'm sorry," he said. He looked up at me, his eyes red and wet and full of something I'd never seen in them before. "Ilara, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I looked at him for a long moment. My father. The man who'd called me an affair child for 28 years. The man who'd let my mother die alone. The man who'd built his entire identity on a lie. He was crying at his own dining room table, surrounded by the family he'd lied to, and he was telling me he was sorry. And I didn't feel anything. That was the strangest part. I'd expected to feel anger, relief, grief, something. But all I felt was a vast, empty quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm has passed and everything that was standing has been leveled. Your apology doesn't change anything, I said. It doesn't bring Mom back. It doesn't give me back the childhood I lost. It doesn't undo 28 years of being called a disgrace. You're sorry because you got caught. You're sorry because the lie finally collapsed. But you're not sorry for what you did. You're sorry for what it cost you. I picked up the folder from the table and closed it. These are mine now, I said. The documents, the truth. I'm taking them with me, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows what really happened. Not for revenge, for her, for my mother. She deserves to be remembered as more than the woman who supposedly betrayed you. She deserves to have her story told. I turned to leave. My sister Margot stood up from her chair. "Elara, wait," she said. "Please, don't go. We need to talk about this. We need to figure out what to do." I paused at the door. I looked at Margot, really looked at her, for the first time in years. She was crying too. Her face was streaked with mascara, and she looked lost, the way a child looks when they've just learned that the world is not the safe place they thought it was. "You know where to find me," I said. "When you're ready to hear the truth, the whole truth, without him in the room, call me. But I'm not staying in this house another minute. Not tonight. Maybe not ever." I walked out of the dining room, through the kitchen, and out the back door into the cool evening air. Patricia followed me, silent and steady, the way she'd been following me since she arrived. The sun had set while we were inside. The yard was dark now, lit only by the citronella candles and the porch light. I walked to the oak tree and stopped, looking up at its branches, the same branches I'd climbed as a child when I needed to escape. "Are you all right?" Patricia asked. I thought about the question. Was I all right? My father had just admitted he'd let my mother die. I'd just learned that my entire identity was built on a lie. I'd just walked away from the only family I'd ever known. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But I think I will be, eventually." Patricia nodded. "Your mother would be proud of you." I looked at her. "You really knew her?" "I did," she said. "She was kind, funny, scared, near the end, but trying to be brave. She talked about you constantly, even when she was bleeding and exhausted. She called you her little star. She said you were the only good thing that had come out of her marriage." I felt the tears come again, but this time they were different. Not grief, not anger. Something closer to gratitude. Gratitude that my mother had loved me, even for just 6 days. Gratitude that she'd had someone like Patricia to carry her story forward. Gratitude that after 34 years of being the affair child, I was finally, truly, someone's daughter. "Thank you," I said to Patricia. "For keeping your promise. For coming here. For everything." She smiled, that same small, sad smile she'd given me earlier. "It was the least I could do," she said. "Now go home. Rest. The hard part is over. Whatever comes next, you'll face it as yourself, not as the affair child, as Elara Vance, Clara's daughter." I hugged her. I hadn't planned to, but I did. She felt small and fragile in my arms, but her grip was strong. And then I walked to my car, got in, and drove away from the house where I'd spent 34 years being someone I wasn't. In my rearview mirror, the porch light grew smaller and smaller until it was just a speck of light in the darkness, and then it was gone. But I wasn't driving away from everything. I was driving toward something, toward the rest of my life, toward the truth, toward a version of myself that had been waiting for me since the day I was born. And somewhere, I hoped, my mother was watching. And she knew. She knew that her little star had finally found her way home. I drove home that night with the windows down and the radio off, the folder riding shotgun in the passenger seat. The highway stretched out dark and empty ahead of me, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the weight of my father's story pressing down on my shoulders. It was gone. After 28 years, it was simply gone. I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment building a little after midnight. The familiar brick facade, the flickering hallway light, the worn carpet on the stairs. Home. The place I'd built for myself, far from the Frost house, far from the family who'd never wanted me. I'd always thought of this apartment as a temporary refuge, a place to hide until I figured out who I really was. But as I climbed the stairs that night, I understood that I'd already figured it out. I was Elara Vance, daughter of Clara Vance, and I was done hiding. I set the folder on my kitchen table and made a pot of tea. It was late, but I wasn't tired. I was too awake, too alive, my mind racing through everything that had happened. Patricia's arrival, my father's collapse, the documents, the look on his face when he finally broke down and cried. I thought about calling someone, my therapist maybe, though it was the middle of the night. My best friend from college, who'd always believed me when I told her the story of the affair child. But I didn't call anyone. I just sat with the quiet and let myself feel whatever came. Grief came first. Grief for my mother, who'd died alone and afraid. Grief for the little girl I'd been, the one who'd believed every word her father said. Grief for the years I'd lost, the love I'd been denied, the identity that had been stolen from me before I was old enough to know it was mine. Then came anger. Not the hot, explosive anger I'd felt in the dining room, but something colder and deeper. Anger at my father, yes, but also anger at the system that had let him get away with it, the hospital that had covered up its mistakes, the relatives who'd nodded along with his lies for 28 years, the whole apparatus of silence that had protected a guilty man and punished an innocent child. And then slowly, like the first light of dawn, came something else. Relief. Because it was over. The lie was dead. The truth was out. Whatever happened next, I would never again have to sit at a dinner table and listen to my father call me a disgrace. I would never again have to shrink into myself, to make myself small, to apologize for existing. I was free. I slept for a few hours, dreamless and deep, and when I woke up the next morning, the sun was bright and the world felt different. Sharper, more real. As if I'd been looking at everything through a dirty window for 34 years, and someone had finally wiped it clean. The phone calls started around 9. The first was from my sister Margot. She was crying, her voice thick and unsteady. "Elara, I'm so sorry," she said. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. All these years I believed him. We all did. And I treated you differently because of it. I never questioned it. I'm so sorry." I listened to her apologize for a long time. I let her say everything she needed to say. And when she was finished, I said, "I believe you. I believe you didn't know. But that's not the same as it being okay." "I know," she said. "I know it's not. I want to make it right. I don't know how, but I want to try." "Then start by listening," I said. "Really listening. Not just to me, but to yourself. Ask yourself why you never questioned him, why none of us did, and then figure out what you're going to do about it." We talked for another hour. I told her things I'd never told anyone. The way our father used to look at me across the dinner table, like I was a stain he couldn't scrub out. The way Aunt Celia would sigh whenever I walked into a room. The way I'd learned to disappear, to be invisible, because being invisible was safer than being seen. Margot cried. I cried too. It was messy and hard, and not at all like the tidy resolutions you see in movies. But it was real, and it was a start. The second call was from Aunt Celia. She didn't apologize. She never had been good at that. But her voice was different, softer, older. "I've known your father for 50 years, she said. "I never thought he was capable of this. I never thought—" She trailed off, and I heard her take a shaky breath. I was wrong. About you. About your mother. About everything. And I have to live with that now. We all do. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to tell her that her realization came 28 years too late. Part of me wanted to scream at her for every time she'd looked at me with that flat, judgmental expression, every time she'd sided with my father without question. But I didn't. I just said, "Thank you for calling," and left it at that. The third call was from a number I didn't recognize. It was a reporter from the local paper. Word had spread faster than I'd expected. The Pewitts had told someone, who'd told someone else. And now the story of Raymond Vance and the paternity test and the settlement was racing through the county like wildfire. The reporter wanted a comment. I said no. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I didn't need to say anything. The documents spoke for themselves. Patricia had kept copies of everything, and she was not the kind of woman who let the truth stay buried. By the end of the week, the full story was out. The paternity test, the hospital report, the settlement, the 28 years of lies. It was all there, in black and white, for anyone who wanted to read it. The fallout was swift and devastating. My father tried to fight it at first. He called me twice, leaving voicemails that swung wildly between fury and self-pity. In one, he accused me of destroying the family. In another, he begged me to talk to him, to let him explain. I didn't answer either call. I wasn't ready. I didn't know if I ever would be, but I heard from others what was happening. The construction company he'd built, the one that had been his pride and joy for 40 years, started losing clients. People in town didn't want to do business with a man who'd let his wife die, and then lied about it for 3 decades. His church asked him to step down from the board. The friends who'd toasted his sacrifice at Father's Day gatherings suddenly couldn't remember his phone number. Travis, no, my brother's name was not Travis in this story. It's Margot and me. My father's second wife, Margot's mother, who'd divorced him years ago, called Margot and said she'd always suspected something was wrong. She'd never liked the way he talked about me. She wished she'd said something sooner. As for the house, the one paid for with the hospital's settlement money, my father was still living there. For now. But the knowledge of where the money had come from had poisoned it. Every room was haunted by the ghost of the woman who'd died so he could pay off the mortgage. I didn't know if he'd stay. I didn't know if he could afford to leave. And honestly, I didn't care. Patricia Donnelly became a quiet presence in my life in the weeks that followed. She didn't push. She just called every few days to check on me, to ask how I was doing, to share little stories about my mother that she'd been holding on to for 28 years. I learned that my mother loved crossword puzzles and hated cooking, that she sang in the hospital hallways when she thought no one was listening, that she'd once stood up to a senior doctor who was mistreating a patient, and even though it nearly got her fired, she never regretted it, that she'd wanted to name me Alara because it meant bright star in a language she couldn't remember, and she'd been sure I would shine. She held you for 6 days, Patricia told me one afternoon, sitting in my apartment with a cup of tea. She was weak, bleeding, scared, but she held you every chance she got. She sang to you. She told you stories. She promised you that she would always love you no matter what happened. I thought about my mother, dying in a hospital bed, making promises to a newborn who would never remember her voice. And I thought about the letter she'd written, the desperate plea to a stranger to tell me the truth. She'd known. She'd known my father would lie, and she'd done the only thing she could do to protect me from beyond the grave. She was the strong one, I said. Not him, her. Always, Patricia said. 3 weeks after Father's Day, I drove to the cemetery where my mother was buried. I'd never been there before. My father had never taken me. He'd said it was too painful, that he couldn't bear to visit her grave. Now I knew the real reason. He couldn't face her. The cemetery was small and quiet, shaded by old oak trees that reminded me of the one in the backyard where I used to hide. Her headstone was simple. Clara Jean Vance, beloved mother, the dates of her birth and death, too close together. No mention of my father, just mother. I knelt in the grass and placed a bouquet of flowers against the stone. I didn't know what kind she liked, so I'd brought wildflowers, the kind that grow on the side of the road, stubborn and bright. I know you now, I said. I know what happened. I know what he did. And I know what you tried to do for me. Thank you. For the letter. For Patricia. For loving me even when you knew you might not get to stay. I sat there for a long time, talking to her in a way I'd never been able to talk to anyone else. I told her about my life, the lonely childhood, the apartment in the city, the job I'd built for myself, a quiet accounting practice that kept me fed and housed, but never quite filled the empty spaces. I told her about Patricia and the folder, and the moment my father collapsed. I told her I was sorry she'd had to die alone, and I promised I would never let her memory be buried again. When I finally stood up to leave, the sun was setting. The sky was streaked with gold and pink, the same colors that had lit the yard on Father's Day. And I felt, for the first time in 34 years, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The family did not heal. Not all at once. Not in the tidy way of stories where everyone learns their lesson and comes back together around a dinner table. Some relatives never called. Some sent letters that I didn't open. My father and I still haven't spoken, and I don't know if we ever will. That's a wound that may never close, and I've made my peace with that. But some things did heal. Margot and I started talking regularly, real conversations, not the stilted, careful exchanges we'd had for years. She came to visit me in the city, and I showed her my apartment and my favorite coffee shop and the bench by the river where I went to think. She told me she was in therapy now, working through the guilt of having believed our father's lies. I told her it wasn't her fault. We were both children, in different ways. Aunt Celia never apologized in so many words, but she sent me a package a few weeks after the party. Inside was a small photograph, old and faded, of a woman with dark hair and tired eyes, holding a newborn against her chest. The same photograph Patricia had sent me, but in better condition. On the back, in my grandmother's handwriting, were the words, Clara and Alara, March 15, 1990. I framed it and hung it on the wall of my apartment. It's still there. Every morning, I look at my mother's face, and I remember that I am not the affair child. I am not the disgrace. I am Clara's daughter. I am the bright star she believed I would be. As for my father, I heard he moved out of the house a few months later. Too many memories, people said. Too many neighbors who knew the truth. He's living in a small apartment in another town now, alone. Margot visits him sometimes. She says he's different, quieter, smaller, as if the lie had been holding him up all those years. And without it, he's nothing but a tired old man with a lot of regrets. I don't pity him. I don't hate him either. The anger has cooled into something more manageable, more distant. He made his choices. He lived with the consequences. And I made mine. I chose the truth. I chose my mother. I chose myself. Patricia passed away 2 years after Father's Day, peacefully, in her sleep. I visited her in the hospital before she died, and she held my hand the way she'd held my mother's 28 years ago. Tell Clara I kept my promise, she said, and I promised I would. At her funeral, I met other people who'd known my mother. Nurses who'd worked with her at County General. Patients whose hands she'd held. A woman who remembered my mother sneaking her an extra blanket when the hospital was cold and understaffed. I stood in that church and listened to story after story about the woman I'd never known, and I realized that my mother had not died in vain. She had touched lives. She had been loved. And now, finally, she was remembered. That's where I'll leave it tonight. One envelope, one retired nurse, one family that finally learned the truth. The barbecue grease might be cold, and the Father's Day speeches long forgotten, but the truth is still standing, solid and steady as an oak tree. If you've ever been called something you knew you weren't, if you've ever carried a weight that wasn't yours to carry, know this: the truth doesn't always come quickly. Sometimes it takes 28 years, but it comes. And when it does, it sets you free. I'm Alara Vance, and you've been watching Alicia Daily Stories. Drop a comment and tell me your thoughts. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss the moment the truth finally finds its way to the table. Until next time, stay strong, stay quiet when you need to, and never, ever stop believing that you deserve to be seen for who you really are.